Ryan, good to see you. Today, we're going to talk through the 6 critical risks that could derail your retirement. When it comes to retirement planning, it's not just about saving enough, it's about preparing for the risks that could undo all your hard work. So, again, today we're going to break down the top 6, starting with sequence risk. What is this?
So sequence risk or sequence of returns risk is that risk that you retire, then all of a sudden at that moment that you retire, now you need to start creating an income stream from your retirement savings and such, and now the market declines, right?
Right.
So the market declines, and now you need to start withdrawing money from that, and that can put you at a very real risk then of running out of money. So there's some solutions to it, but first let's take a look at what sequence risk or how it actually works, kind of in an example.
Hmm.
So we've got Mr. Blue here and Mr. Green, let's call them. And so with both of these folks, you can see that they're investing money for a 15-year period of time. And over that 15-year period, they start with $100,000, and both of them average a 4% rate of return over that period of time. But the difference is here is that they have the same rates of return, but they happen in the exact opposite order. And
Right.
so as a result, you'll see after 15 years, the differences here are staggering. The difference between about 105,000 and about 35,000.
Wow.
Again, same average rate of return, but very, very differences, very, very different results at the end.
Yeah.
So it's a risk we need to be aware of. I don't want this to be something that completely scares anyone. There are ways to be able to minimize this risk. One of them being, of course, that we could allocate certain amounts of money to cash or bond, typically short-term bonds and other things, for a period of years, maybe just a few years, and by doing that, that will help give the stock market presumably the chance to recover. And then at that time, when the stock market recovers, then you could go to start withdrawing money from those funds over there on that side. But it's important to just understand what the risk is and not go into retirement blind. Too often, Aaron, I see people that they get up to retirement. They've done such a great job of accumulating over the
Yeah.
years, and sometimes they've done really good in certain types of investments, and then all of a sudden they retire, and then they have so much risk in their portfolio. And the truth is they could do really great. They could double their money or even better, right? If they're in something really risky that does really good. The potential's there. But the potential is also on the other side that things could now turn south. I've been around long enough where I remember back in the end of the 1990s to the beginning of 2000. I remember all the people that were so excited about the tech stocks that they own. And many people were doing very, very well, making huge returns. I remember one guy in particular, he retired right around 2000. It was maybe just a little bit before. And he was only in like 7 or 8 tech stocks. I'll never forget this story. And he's in 7 or 8 different tech stocks. And I remember he was gonna retire. And I remember telling him, I said, you should really consider diversifying this risk a lot. And it was tough for him because for him, he had done so well over this period of time, and quite frankly, I was pretty young at that time, so I can kind of understand his perspective a little bit when he was talking to me. But nevertheless, I'll never forget that, and I wonder what ended up happening, because
Mm.
over those first 3 years of the century, it was really bad for tech stocks, and many people
Right.
lost a lot of money, and that could
Right.
really affect your retirement. So,
Mhm.
the bottom line, sequence of returns risk, it's important to understand what it is, how it affects you, but just need to make sure that we have a plan in order to help mitigate that.
Right. All right. Next, we have withdrawal rate risk. So we've heard and talked about before the 4% rule. Is this what we're talking about?
Well, the 4% rule comes up a lot. And,
Yeah.
as I always mention, I believe that typically for most people, the 4% rule is going to lead to underspending, most likely for most folks in retirement. That's just what I've seen in practice. And when I run different analysis, different retirement plans, different Monte Carlos, different types of simulations, most likely I believe people are going to underspend, like I was saying. But here's the thing that falls short with this 4% rule. You read these things out there in different magazines. This is how much you can spend and that sort of thing. In the real world, people have different cash flows and they come in at different times. For instance, you might retire, at 63, but you're not planning to turn on your Social Security until you're, full retirement age, let's say until 67. So you might be withdrawing more from your portfolio up front, and then you're withdrawing less, maybe, at 67 when your Social Security benefits begin, just as an example. Or maybe you've got an inheritance that that you're going to receive. You're going to receive a certain amount of money. And so you've got that cash flow, or maybe it's a sale of a property or a business or whatever it is. It could be any one of a number of different situations, but most people have different cash flows and they're going to come in at different times in retirement. So the spending that you're going to do from your retirement accounts, as far as the percentage and how much you're taking out, that varies over the years. And
Hmm.
the key point here, Aaron, is that it also the other key thing is that in retirement, most people I find don't want to just spend in a linear fashion.
Right.
Most people want to spend more money up front, and a lot more money up front. Typically, I find when I'm talking to people when we're designing plans is those first 5 years, 10 years or so, perhaps, those are the years that we really want to spend a lot, maybe go on those big vacations, do all those things. And so a lot of times we're spending pretty heavily initially, but with the going in with the mindset that we know that unless the markets really perform well, that we're going to be scaling back our spending in our 70s and 80s. And then a lot of times in these discussions, I find that, hey, by the time I get into my, 80s, late 80s, yeah, I mean, as long as I have enough to meet my basic expenses, I'm not going to be going on those big trips and other things. This is going to be fine.
Hmm.
Um, but it's so important. Yeah, just don't read these magazines, see withdrawal rates. Just take all that with a grain of salt. Each person's plan is
Right.
specific and individual to them.
Right. All right, next we have what could be one of your biggest expenses in retirement: healthcare and long term care, which we know 7 out of 10 people will need at some point.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that is what the statistics say for long-term care.
Yeah.
The only thing that I would say about that is that some people that need long-term care don't need it for very long at all.
Right.
So that kind of skews the statistics there. Now, don't get me wrong. Some people that need long-term care will need it for a very extended period of time. Could be 5 years or more, especially if you have a cognitive impairment or something like that. So that definitely happens. I think the key thing here is to know is that when you go into retirement, make sure that you understand how Medicare works, understanding what Medicare covers, what it doesn't cover, clearly understanding what your options are between Medicare, the traditional Medicare, and Medicare Advantage, and deciding what is the best option there for you. And then again, for what Medicare doesn't cover, those would be things that would require long-term care, and then figuring out if you do need long-term care, how would you pay for it? Don't go into retirement just thinking, oh, that would never happen to me, right? That's not we don't want to do that. We want to go in assuming that it probably will happen. And then so if it does happen, how are we going to pay for that? Now that could be insurance. And if you are going to buy long-term care insurance, that doesn't mean you need to buy a completely robust insurance policy. You could buy one maybe partially to kind of partially insure, maybe just transfer some of that risk to the insurance company, or maybe not transfer any of the risk at all to the insurance company and just decide to absorb that on your own. I was working with one couple recently where the decision was made to say, okay, let's take a look at our retirement plan. They were both in their early 60s. And then to say, okay, if we don't buy the long-term care insurance, but let's say that we need long-term care maybe in our 80s, which is typically what happens as we get older. That's typically when we would need that care if we do. And so if we earmark maybe a certain amount of our retirement savings just for long-term care, what would our spending look like outside of that? Would we have enough? Are we able to have the lifestyle that we want to have? And so that's kind of what we did. We earmarked a portion. They had plenty. for them to still be able to live on today. So that was the decision that was made there. But different ways to approach that. One of them also I should touch on that sometimes gets forgotten is is your home. Assuming that you own your home, you have equity there, kind of as a last resort. Even you've always got that too. So sometimes that could be seen as kind of a pseudo long-term care policy, if you will. So different ways to approach that. Different people are going to have different feelings on it, and that's fine. But again, just make sure that when you go into retirement, that you know that that's a risk, understand what those costs could be,
Right.
and have a plan as to how you would pay for that if it arises.
Right. And our next risk is taxation.
Yeah. So one of the key things that you need to be considering as you approach retirement, and then as you start to develop your income plan, because you know as you get into retirement, it's so much different than in your working years. Because when you're working, if you're getting a paycheck maybe from an employer every 2 weeks, life is a lot simpler. Maybe fund money into a 401k, you pay for your health insurance. It's all kind of funded through your paycheck. But now in retirement, it's all different. You retire, the paycheck stop, and now it's, well, okay, should I withdraw money from my 401k? Should I start my Social Security? Should my spouse start their Social Security now? What should we do about that? What about my pension if I have that? What should I do? If I have a taxable account, a brokerage account, that's separate. Maybe I have a Roth, right? So it's kind of determining when you're going to make those withdrawals from your certain retirement accounts, when you're going to turn on different income sources like Social Security. And it's important to think about this in the context of how do I minimize the taxation that I have to pay over time. And in sometimes mistakes get made. I see where it's it's like we're trying to do too much of a good thing. Like as an example, we look here, different types of accounts are going to be treated or taxed differently. And so, like if you have a taxable account, which is where a lot of people are likely going to start withdrawing some money from early in retirement. In the nice thing about doing that is that we can manage and try to harvest capital gains, things like that. And a lot of times we can keep taxes really low, but we don't want to keep it so low that even if we just take the standard deduction, that we lose out on the opportunity maybe to withdraw money from a 401k or an IRA and maybe get some money out of there and perhaps not pay any income tax at all, again, because of the standard deduction, or maybe pay taxes at 10% or 12%. It all depends on where you are specifically within the tax brackets. But the name of the game is, how do we get money out of the accounts that we've worked so hard to save for over the years in the most tax efficient manner possible? And if you're married, don't forget that when one spouse passes away, you're going to have to file as a single person. And now all of a sudden, your tax situation is a little tougher. So a lot to think about there. So we'll just leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. Also, little proactive planning goes a long way with that taxation, as you're mentioning. Next, we have the silent thief, inflation.
Yeah, you can't forget about this one. So, the thing is because, we are living so much longer. Of course, inflation is going to play even more of that, or cause even more of an impact on your overall plan.
Yeah.
Because if you retire, let's just say, again, let's just pretend you retire at 65 and you actually live until 85 or 95 or something like that. And that's a 20 or 30-year period. The old days, and I say the old days, maybe a couple generations ago, when people, quite frankly, just didn't live as long, retirement planning was so much easier because the inflation really didn't really play as much of an impact if we're only talking about a very short life expectancy. But if you just take, let's say, using the rule of 72, and if we just assume a 3% inflation rate. Well, you take 72, you divide that by 3. That means in about 24 years, you're going to need twice as much money to live on. Now, that gives you just kind of a rough idea and just kind of a simple tool with that rule of 72 to figure that out. But the other thing is I was kind of mentioning here earlier is that we do want to be thinking about is that for most people, most likely you want to spend more money earlier in retirement. So maybe we don't need our income in retirement to keep up with inflation all throughout retirement. If inflation goes up maybe 3 or 4%, maybe all we need to do is to have our income increase at maybe 1 or 2%, something like that. The
Mhm.
key here, and this is why it's so important to make sure that you know what are your needs, what do you actually need to spend each month, for housing, perhaps for food, things like that, and then what do you want to spend, and then
Mhm.
devising the plan around that in order to make that happen and make you feel comfortable that you've got the income that you need.
Right. And our last risk, something you were just touching on, it is longevity, also known as the risk multiplier.
Yeah, and so the thing with longevity risk is this is kind of the overlying risk because this really affects everything. And this is what
Everything
I
else.
was
Yeah.
talking about just like you said just a moment ago is that the longer we live, the more all these other risks are amplified, so to speak. The longer we live, the more inflation is going to play a toll, as an example right there. Again, as I already mentioned, we are living so much longer, and so we need to make sure that we're planning for this. The big thing here too is that I find is that it's so often people go into retirement and they just don't spend nearly as much as they actually could. And it's typically because they've been great savers. It's hard to make that transition. And now they're thinking, well, I'm not getting that paycheck. And I'm just not 100%, confident, sold. Yes, the numbers tell me objectively, I see it. And I know it makes sense, but it's still uncomfortable to really pull the trigger and to do that and to do that or to spend more. And so
Yeah.
that's why it's so important to really do that planning, to really understand how everything works out, how it's built in order
Yeah.
to sustain the income that you need.
Right. Well, you want to enjoy that hard earned retirement. And all comes back to peace of mind, as you're saying.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the thing. You work so hard. You got to spend that hard-earned money. The last thing you want to do is retire again. I'll just say 65, and now you're pulling in the reins, and now all of a sudden now you're 73, and the RMDs kick in, and now you have to take the RMDs because the government makes you right. You got to, and now maybe it's even more than you actually need. Now you're paying taxes unnecessarily, or maybe then you get to the point maybe now you're into your 80s and you start thinking to yourself, and I've had these conversations with people, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm never going to spend all this money
Hmm.
now. I
Hmm.
should have spent it earlier.
Yeah. Right. Right. And it all comes back to having that plan, as you're talking about. And it's not one and done. As we talk through these risks, clearly they are moving targets. So, Ryan, I know that this is part of, you sitting down with clients, making sure that all these risks are mitigated. So if somebody wants to talk this through with you, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Best thing to do is to go to the website, which is kravitzfinancial.com, and then go to the process page. You can read up a little bit more, and you could schedule a call right there that works for you.
Okay, great. Ryan, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Aaron.